So do have that chapter open in front of you if you haven't already opened it up, and follow along, because it's really helpful to follow through the passage as we talk through it. So we're following on in the life of Abraham, still known as Abram at this stage. Forgive me if I occasionally say Abraham out of habit, but he hasn't yet had this change of name and change of calling. And this passage starts with a fantastic promise. So the promise it starts with: do not be afraid, Abraham, I am your shield, your very great reward. That was a passage that I referred to last week as well. I just want to pause there for a second so we don't miss it. Right there at the very beginning of this passage, Abraham's real reward is not all the other things that he has received, although he has received wealth, and he's received large amounts of livestock, and he has these promises, but really his greatest reward is right there at the very beginning of the passage. His reward is God. And we need to remember that for ourselves as well. Whatever other blessings we search for, look for, hope for, our greatest treasure is Christ himself. Our greatest treasure is God, who has come close, who is knowable, and who one day we will be with forever. So don't lose sight of that as we go through. But he starts off with a very bold promise. He says, you're going to have this great reward. And Abraham immediately questions it. And I wanted to ask the question, is it okay to question God? Is that all right? So I thought I'd do a quick straw poll. So yes, no, or yes, but, ... So hands up for yes, it's okay to question God. Okay. Hands up for no. Hands up for yes, but. Okay, you know what I'm going to do, don't you? I'm going to ask you what the but is. Keep your hand up if you're willing to be put on the spot. No one. Okay, maybe I should ask at the end. Okay, I want to suggest that, yes, it is okay to question God. But there's definitely different types of question, aren't there? One of the things that comes out clearest in Abraham's life is that he talks with God very straight. He's honest about what he thinks, and that is commendable. But there are different types of question as we go through the Bible. In fact, there's different types of question, full stop. So Brandon was telling us about this plan to have a hot chocolate stand to try and connect with youth who otherwise aren't connecting with the church. Now, when he came and pitched that idea to me, I could have said, oh, Brandon, how's that going to work? Expecting details. Or I could have said, oh, how's that going to work? Now, immediately you see the difference in that question. It's actually two different questions, isn't it? One of them isn't really a question, to be honest. It's just a put down, and the other one is a question. We're reading a text, and we don't have tone of voice, and we need to be aware of that when we read questions. They can be said in different tones, and that really matters. Actually, I wanted to pick up on just a few examples of other questions in the scriptures and how God responds to them. So, very famously, because we read it at least once a year at Advent, Mary, when she's visited by the angel Gabriel, and he says, Mary, you're going to bear a son. And she says, how can that be? I'm a virgin. Now, in that question, there's no condemnation from God. He just lays out the answer. Okay, this is how it's going to work. The power of the Holy Spirit will overshadow you, and he will create in you a child, and it will be called the Son of the Most High. So that's Mary's question. Zechariah, though, just a little bit before in the same gospel, he's standing in front of the altar and an angel appears and says, even in your old age, you're going to have a child. And he says, how can I be sure of this? And he gets a rebuke, doesn't he? He gets a telling off. Gabriel says, hang on a second, I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I've been sent to tell you this. And now you're going to be unable to speak because you didn't believe the word that God spoke to you. There's a rebuke there. And it's a loving rebuke, but there's a rebuke there. If you look in the book of 2 Kings, Elisha is in a city at the time that there's a famine in the city because they're being besieged. And there's horrible things going on in the city, as does happen sometimes in a city under siege. And the king comes to him and says, why should I wait for the Lord anymore? In other words, I'm about to give up on the Lord altogether. And Elisha says, tomorrow, at this time, at this gate, barley and wheat will be selling at rock bottom prices. And the officer who's next to the king, so one of his most trusted advisors, says, even if God opened the floodgates of heaven, how could that happen? There's a question. And Elisha says to him, well, it will happen, but you won't taste any of it. there's a very stern rebuke there. In fact, actually, he's trampled in the crush as the people rush to get the provision that God has made. And when there is this surfeit of grain, and it does indeed sell at rock bottom price, there's a very stern rebuke there. It's a different question, isn't it? Mary's just simply like, God, I understand babies, I think. How is this going to work? Zechariah, he's got an angel in front of him, and he's like, oh, God, I just want to be really sure. And God's like, I've given you a sign. Why are you asking for another sign? This officer, it's a rejection of God's word to him, isn't it? It's like, how could God even do that? Don't be ridiculous. So there are different questions. What is it that Abraham's doing in this? What's his question like? Let's read it again. Do not be afraid, Abraham. I'm your shield, your very great reward. And Abraham says, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is a servant in my household. What's his real question here? It's not, God, how are you going to give me a child? I'm too old. It's, God, you haven't given me a child. What's the point of pouring out your blessing on me? What's the point of it? I'm childless. I can't carry this blessing forward into the promise that you've made. There's a deep pain in him there. I want to just note that and say, sometimes we can think that we're behaving well as Christians by not carrying our pain to God in a painful way. We think we need to dress it up nicely to say it to God, when actually we're deeply hurting about something. At the moment, I have a friend, a very, very long-standing friend, who's going through liver failure for the second time, may well end up on a transplant list very shortly. And I'm upset. I want him to have a full, fulfilled life. I want him to go on being a parent to his children and a husband to his wife. And he's a good friend. And I'm in pain about that. And God, I know you can sort this out. You will be in situations like that. You probably have been in situations like that and will be again. And Abraham doesn't dress it up. He says, God, what's the point? I'm childless. This hurts. And he brings it to God like it is. I think there's an encouragement for us to do the same then. But you can see the type of question he's asking and the heart it's coming from in how he deals with the response. Because God doesn't explain how it's going to work. He just says, you'll have a son. That man won't be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He doesn't explain how that's going to work for Abraham at his age and for Sarah never having been able to have children. But he says it will, and Abraham believes him. We don't know how God's speaking to Abraham in this moment. Maybe he's just hearing a voice in his head as he sits outside his tent. Maybe it's an audible voice. Maybe he had a vision. We don't know how God spoke to him at this point, but whatever it was, God was able to take him on trust. Abraham was able to take God on trust and just say, yeah, okay, I believe you. And it says here, Abraham believed the Lord and God credited it to him as righteousness. Now, you know, don't you? This is an absolutely key verse in the whole book of Genesis. Paul picks up on it in Romans chapter 4 as well. Abraham believed and God credited it to him as righteousness. Before he's done anything, before there's any covenants, before there's any circumcision or anything like this, there's this simple exchange. Abraham puts his trust in God and God counts him as righteous. And Paul goes on to explain that means we can't possibly be getting right with God by what we do. It's not about that. Even before doing things, even before covenants, even before circumcision, it's about faith. And that's why we get to call ourselves children of Abraham, even though I actually have no idea physically what my lineage is, going back that far. I very much doubt you do either. I don't know what my lineage biologically is, but I am a child of faith because I have put my faith in God. And you are children of Abraham if you have put your faith in Jesus. We get to be children of righteousness. We get to be counted righteous before God because God gives it as a gift to those who trust him. Not earned, but as a gift. And Paul is very keen to point out God credits it to him. He says, if you earn something, it isn't credited to you. If you earn something, it's paid to you as wages. This is a gift. It's a gift of God. righteousness to those who trust in him. Okay, Abraham brings his painful questions to God. Then he questions the land promise. This is really interesting. I wonder why he questions this one more. So he says, God, you haven't given me any children. And God says, I'll give you a son. And then he says, I brought you out of Ur to give you this land. And Abraham doesn't go, what's the point or anything. He says, how can I be sure? I was turning this over. I don't know if you have any insights on this. I was turning this over and I was thinking, I wonder if that's just the accumulation of trust. He's like, okay, here I am with no extended family, no land, a nomad. I can believe God for one of those things, but now you're basically asking me just to throw my entire future up in the air and just trust that I'm hearing you right. And so he says, how can I know? He asks for a sign. Now, interestingly, again, there's no rebuke from God. God doesn't say, why are you asking for a sign? I think, again, that there's an encouragement to us here. God wants to lead us on. He describes himself as our shepherd. The good shepherd, Jesus describes himself as. Shepherds want their sheep to know where they're supposed to go. If Abraham had been going, I want a sign, because actually he just wanted to try and get out of it. And you suspect maybe that's what Gideon's doing when he says, I put out the fleece, and now God, would you reverse the sign and do it the other way around? Maybe he just wants to be sure, but maybe it was a little bit of procrastination of trying to put this off a little bit. And certainly with Moses, when he says, how am I going to speak to Pharaoh? I'm not a gifted, eloquent speaker. And then God says, look, I can sort that out. And he's like, no, just send someone else. You're like, that's what the heart really was. It was procrastination. It was putting it off. That's not what's going on here. Abraham just wants to know, God, is this definitely right? Am I definitely hearing you? And God meets him in it graciously. I don't think God minds giving signs. In fact, sometimes God rebukes people for not asking for signs. Do you know that passage in Isaiah? The virgin will be with child, the famous prophecy of Jesus Christ. Where it comes about is that King Ahaz is worried about these kings, and Isaiah comes to him and says, it's okay, they're going to be overcome. Don't worry, you're going to be fine. And, ask for a sign to confirm it. And Ahaz thinks he's more pious than God, and he says, no, I won't test God, I won't ask for a sign. And Isaiah gets really annoyed and he says, listen, house of David, isn't it enough to test the patience of men? Are you going to test God's patience as well? Ask for a sign. Okay, if you won't ask for a sign, here's a sign. The virgin will be with child. And he goes on to give this incredible prophecy, which probably had a near fulfillment as well as a fulfillment in Christ. So it's okay to question God in this kind of way as well, as long as the heart is a heart of God. I want to be obedient. Am I hearing you right? Now, we all have decisions to make, big ones, small ones. It could be really little things about what you do with your day. It could be really big ones about career decisions or moving or, a calling. But in all of those, it's okay to ask God to lead us clearly. What matters is your heart then to follow. God says to Abraham, leave your house and go. And he does. His heart is to follow. It's okay to question him as long as our heart is then to listen to the answer. It's important that God isn't inconsistent in this. It's our hearts that are inconsistent and fickle. What's God's response then? So Abraham says, God, how can I be sure that I'm going to receive this land? And then he falls asleep. God says, chop up these animals, and then he falls asleep and God gives him a sign. Chopping up the animals seems like an odd thing for us. It totally made sense to Abraham. So you may know this already, but in case you don't, there was a practice in the ancient Near East of making covenants where you would chop up animals and you'd put them either side of this walkway. And Caroline, can you come up for a second? So I'm making a covenant with Caroline. We put these dead animals like this either side, and then we stand here and we make our agreement. We talk as we walk between these dead animals. And what we're saying is, I'm making a promise to you, and you're making a promise to me, and may God do this to us, i.e. chop us up and put us in half, if we break our covenants. It's a solemn thing, and then you'd sit down and you'd eat together. Thanks, that's great. So that's the picture. That's what they would do. And it was a way of making a covenant. We see it elsewhere in the Bible, actually. In Jeremiah is it's about 35 off the top of my head. He's calling Israel to task and saying, listen, you're not living up to the covenant you made with God. You walked between the pieces, he says. You walked between the pieces, and I'm judging you based on that covenant. You didn't live up to it. And that's what God is doing here with Abraham. He says, chop up these animals and lay them there. But then it's different, isn't it? Because Abraham doesn't get up and walk between them with God. He falls into this deep slumber, and God, symbolized by that smoking pot and brazier, moves between the pieces, backwards and forwards. This is a covenant in which God has taken everything on himself. It's what's called a unilateral covenant. God hasn't asked anything more of Abraham. He's just said, I am promising this to you. It's on me. I am promising this to you. What a generous, wonderful response from God to this question of, like, how can I be sure? God's like, listen, trust me. This is all on me. I'm making a promise to you. And then Abraham believes. This is really, really encouraging, isn't it? This is how we get to live as well. We get to question God. We get to be honest and frank with God. Not to dress things up and be, pretend to be like we don't have any problems, we don't have any issues, we don't have any questions. But in return, God is gracious to us and we get to trust him. And that's how we're supposed to live. I just want to make a little aside here as well. If you go to verse 16, as Iceland was reading, it's not all good news. God says, I will give this land to your descendants. But they will first of all be slaves as a nation in Egypt. They'll be enslaved there, and then I will bring them out. And then he goes on to say this, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now, again, if we're thinking about little key verses here, one of the things that we struggle with most, perhaps one of the questions that we might have when we read the Old Testament is, how do we square the God that we read about in the New Testament with some of the things that we read in the Old Testament where whole nations are driven out or put to death, cities are razed? How do we square that? Now, we can sort of sit there and be very sort of, it's not a problem. But actually, it's hard, isn't it? It's hard reading. We look at that and we go, really? At least I do. It's a process I'm going, not sort of saying that I necessarily stay in that place, but it's a process I'm going through. We have here a bit of a clue. The sin of the Amorites hasn't yet reached its full measure. This nation, the Amorites, by the time that Israel displaces them, are fully into the worship of Baal and various other gods, which involve all kinds of horrors. It involves ritual prostitution, it involves sacrifice of children, and this is part of their culture. I once watched a video about some of these practices, and I felt physically sick afterwards, and I'll spare you some of the details, but things they found in archaeological digs that point to the practices that went on. And there was this sort of potent, heady, toxic mix of sex and death and fertility, and it's just horrible. And an entire nation was caught up in it. And in the midst of this, God says, I'm patient. It's going to be 400 years before I punish that. So just in all of our wrestling with that, we do need to remember God's patience. God could have judged all of that stuff going on, and he said, no, I'm patient. But when it reaches its full measure, I will deal with it. Just a little clue there. Our culture likes to question if God is really good. And the fact is that every culture will have some problems with God, because cultures change like this, don't they? Things that we think are okay now, 200 years ago were definitely not okay, probably 800 years before they were again. And that goes about all kinds of things, issues of life and death and sexuality and birth and gender and all these different things, what you should do and how you should live. It all changes all the time. And human society has this wonderful way of saying, well, exactly how we've got it now, that's how God should be. And never mind that in a different country in the world they disagree, never mind that 50 years ago they disagree, and in 50 years' time they'll think we're wrong. God should agree with us exactly as we are now. And As a culture, we hold God up and we say, we want to assess God by our standards. We want to decide if he is good. And here are some things that we don't like. And I don't know if you have, but I've seen plenty of stuff in my time on social media ripping into verses in Leviticus about how women are treated in the book of Leviticus and saying, how can God be good? These Christians are so toxic. And actually, the fact is, it's not about measuring whether God is good by our standards. God defines what good is. He made the universe. The real question is, does our idea of good line up with God? And if not, how do we bring it into line? So it's okay to have these questions. It's okay to say, God, I really struggle with the fact that this nation gets driven out 400 years later and the way in which that happens. It's okay to struggle with that, as long as when we see the gap between what we think should be right and how God is, we expect the gap to close that way as we move closer towards how God declares himself to be. If we put ourselves in the position of judge and say, God, you need to show me how actually you're closer to what I think is good, we've got things the wrong way around, and we're not going to be satisfied in that. And what we end up doing is twisting the text to say something it doesn't, or just quietly ignoring it. And I do have a close relative who I love very much, who says, I can't read the Psalms because of those bits about babies and, talking about the end of Psalm 138. She reads the difficult bits and she's like, I can't square that. So I just read the New Testament. And even in the New Testament, there's some bits that are uncomfortable reading. We've got to learn that the change has got to come in us as we understand more about God. But probably with the cultural lenses we have, we're not going to make that journey all the way. And the rest we just have to take on trust. God is good. That's who he is. God is love. That's who he is. If we don't fully understand it, well, one day we will. So, just want to briefly land this with us. 3 ways in which this passage directly affects us. And the first one is going back to that question about God credited it to him as righteousness. We know, I think probably all of us, I'm just scanning around to see if there's any faces I don't know who might not agree, but I think probably all of us know that we are where we are today, saved by Jesus Christ, because of faith in him and because of what he has done, not because of anything we have done. But over time, as we try to live for God, sometimes we slip into thinking that it's a little bit about the fact that we do better. Sometimes. Not all of us maybe, but it is an easy slip to make. We need to remind ourselves that we stand on what Jesus has done and on faith in that, not on ourselves. And in that, we need to be so sure of that when we talk with other people about Jesus, what comes out is a call to faith, not just a call to change their lives. The second application is this: we need to make sure that our standards are gradually changing over time to fit God's standards, not that we expect God to change to fit us. He's God, we're not. Get your own universe, make your own rules. The last one is this, though, and I think this is probably the one that, when I was preparing, I was most convinced we need to really think through. There are twin dangers that Abraham navigates between, at least here. Elsewhere, he might not do so well. And one is pretending that we trust, when actually what it really is we don't dare ask the questions. I was having a conversation recently with somebody who very much wanted to work through a difficult issue with a close friend of theirs, but they didn't dare bring it up because they couldn't quite trust what the response might be. And so they carried on just pretending that it was all okay. And it just sat beneath the surface. And we were talking it out and I said, you know that that's just fear keeping you from having reality. And he was like, yeah, I do know that. We can't pretend that we trust God just because we don't dare ask him the questions. We need to be frank with him. We need to be blunt with him and say, God, here are my questions. Would you help me understand? Would you guide me? But also, the other side of it that I have seen, and perhaps you have as well, sometimes there are people who are like, I just tell God things as they are. But with that comes quite a cynicism sometimes. It's like God is always disappointing us, but we can talk about that and I can tell God he's disappointed. And the heart there, you hear the heart there, that's wrong as well. Have you ever heard that? I've definitely heard that from people. It's like, well, God promises all this stuff and we don't always see it, but that's okay because we can talk about it honestly. And in that there's a cynicism that we also need to put to death. Abraham's response isn't cynicism and it isn't pretending everything's okay. It's honesty with God and then trust. It's great to be honest with God as long as when he responds, we then listen to him and act on that and follow in faith. I wonder if we could pray that we would be people who navigate those twin dangers well, that we would be people who are known for speaking honestly with God. That when others outside the church say, how do you do business with this thing that's happened in your life? You say, well, look, I've spoken with God about it. This is what he says. Paul's able to do that. When we don't even know what physical affliction it was that he describes as a thorn in his flesh. He says, I've asked God to take it away, and God said, my grace is sufficient for you. Well, what an answer that is. It isn't a cure-all fix, but he's asked God the question, and he's got the answer, and it isn't this awkward thing that somebody could say to him, oh, you talk about this amazing God, and yet he hasn't healed you. He's like, yeah, I know. Here's what's happened. I've spoken with him about it, and he said, I'm leaving it with you for this reason. So shall we raise our hearts in prayer now? God, we want to be those who, like Abraham, are honest with you about our thoughts. You know them anyway. God, we want to bring our questions to you, but Father, as much as that, we also want to listen to your answers and trust you. You are totally trustworthy and totally faithful and worth trusting. God, would you change us over time? Would you make us more trusting in you? Would you help us to trust you as is worth trusting? God, would you help us not to become cynical or disappointed, but to press into you for answers where we feel dissatisfied? And we thank you yet again, God, that you have done it all. That the righteousness we have is because of what you have done, and that you simply ask us to trust you to receive it. Amen.